the biggest opportunity right now to reclaim our healthcare, especially for women and families?
I think starting to recognize a lot of what went wrong. What are we supposed to believe? And what is something that we don't know that we should know as women, I would say. I think that you all have more power than you believe you do. You're all extraordinarily equal in society and in the sight of God. And I think there's a lot of pressure that women have to essentially conform and to kind of model and look like a certain thing.
We noticed that 79.2% of you are not subscribed. So if you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Come subscribe. We give you 5 days a week of free weight loss advice. And I mean, come on. It's a pretty cool vibe over here. So I'd love it if you'd come join. We really appreciate all of your support. So please don't forget to subscribe.
Hello and welcome to the Step It Up podcast. Today we have an honored guest, Diana Lutfi, and she is the founder of the Healing Science Policy Institute. She's going to tell you all about what that means, but let's just say that she's brilliant, she's a shining light, and she is here to make the changes, be part of the changes that are taking place right now that I'm sure all of you are sensing, but that are actually happening, and there is a revolution upon us. And Diana is definitely a part of that. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's to be decided. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What is the Healing Science Policy Institute?
So it's a think tank that basically got formed from January 6, 2025, where there was a group of scientists and physicians that came together and wrote a support letter countering the opposition around Kennedy's confirmation for HHS. During that time, there was a lot of individuals that kind of coalesce around campaigning against Kennedy. And there was a group of physicians that kind of came together. It was led by Protect Our Care. That organization essentially set itself up to write this letter and to gather about 20,000 plus physician signature saying that Kennedy is not fit. In addition to the academic community's gathering of Nobel laureates, about 77 came together, also said that Kennedy was not fit. What this group did in terms of coming together was I had written rebuttal letter alongside a couple of other scientists and physicians coalescing together in support of Kennedy, also clarifying what science is and what healing can look like, and healing coming from many, many different forms, as well as clarifying some of the positions that were taken by Kennedy.
Right. So in short, the Healing Science Policy is really an effort to reestablish what science is.
Yeah.
Is that what I understood?
What science is, what healing can be, and what the types of changes that we can see in terms of a counter narrative.
And there was like a catalytic moment. There was a moment that was, like a catalyst. You were a catalyst in your idea of creating this letter, and then a bunch of people signed it. Like an astounding amount of people signed it and came together, and you were like, oh gosh, there's something here. Like the stars just aligned, and then boom, like there was a spark and something happened.
Yeah.
Wow.
So during that time, it was kind of strange too, because many catalytic moments that you were talking about had happened. I just finished writing an amicus for Detransitioners and bringing our amicus group to DC.
What is an amicus group?
An amicus brief just means friend of the court. So from a legal sort of perspective, there was a case called U.S. versus Skrmetti, and that case was about 26 states banning certain sorts of treatments that were traditionally used to address gender dysphoria that helped in the medical transitioning of minors. Those states that banned it decided to kind of come together and pass legislation around prohibiting those types of treatment. During that time, there was a coalition with the ABA, the AMA, and a couple of different massive medical organizations that said this was not only unconstitutional, but this, went against our standard of care. There's not a single physician, not a single individual that would kind of argue against that. And so there's a clear narrative. But the clients and the individuals that I represented were the detransitioners themselves, the people that were directly hurt and abused by the system. And at that time, it was kind of crazy because I wasn't really even thinking about writing an amicus or participating in this. But after hearing some of the arguments that were essentially being made from other lawyers, that's really where I knew that having an ethics perspective would be helpful.
Right.
And
So ethics, for those who don't know, is like, right and wrong, like what's good and bad, ethics. I mean, I'm really simplifying it, but
yeah.
but I mean, I think this is really where we are right now as a
Yes.
humanity, as a society, because
Yes.
as you know, we talk a lot about weight loss, and we're fighting against a narrative that's body positivity, the fake kind, not the real kind. The real
Have
kind.
you seen body positivity on social media?
Yes.
Have you seen like the morbidly obese models
Yes.
and girls?
Yes.
Have you seen the ones that are like paid to promote like fat products and
I've
paid
not.
to promote, obese clothing and things like that? Have you seen any of that?
I've not.
There are these obese women who eat junk food on camera, who are
Mhm.
sponsored by companies that pay them to eat their food on camera or promote their clothing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's abuse. Like, you're abusing people's eyes, I think. I think you're
Mhm.
abusing social media and
Yeah.
using it in a negative way. And they're also paying dietitians and nutritionists now to say that all food is healthy. Like anything, even
Yeah.
fried Oreos. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I was 320 pounds at one point in my life, and I was eating fried Oreos and having dietitians and nutritionists tell me it was okay.
Yeah.
So, in ethics and things like that, where do you fall in this movement? What are your thoughts?
So it's kind of interesting because I came from a perspective where I really, really looked at both sides. I was trained by Jody Halpern at the University of California, Berkeley, and she's technically still head of bioethics there. She does a lot of work on clinical empathy and trying to figure out and understand where people are coming from that modeled their decision making. And so instead of actually even looking at right and wrong from like a very objective standpoint, you look at why people choose the types of behaviors and the types of values that end up driving their decisions before you can then say, this is how that is destroying them as an individual, as a person, in terms of society, and how those sorts of forces that perpetuate and create trauma and that reinforce that cycle gets reinforced. And so that's how I was trained in ethics, which I feel like was a huge blessing because I got to also see the other side in terms of how ferocious people were about not talking about certain topics. Like vaccines was a huge one. In public health, you can't even talk about a different form of ethics where you say, hey, if you're really talking about my body, my choice, why does that not necessarily apply in the context of public health?
It's such a quagmire. To me, it feels insane to have to dissect all of the aspects of it. And it feels almost like someone's ripping my skin off, like, oh my gosh, like this is like that.
Yeah.
We hear our politicians saying common sense solutions, because when we think about healing modalities or medicine, I mean, people have been practicing holistic medicine, naturopathy, homeopathy
Yep.
For centuries.
Yes.
Throughout every culture and race and religion and creed.
Mhm.
And it's like all of a sudden it's like we can talk about Ozempic as a frontline solution for for obesity.
Yeah.
But we can't say, oh, by the way, just a little reminder, newsflash, your body can heal itself.
Yeah.
We can't actually say that.
We can't.
So which is unethical?
Yeah.
The Ozempic conversation as a front line of defense, or the fact that your body can heal naturally? I mean, what do you say?
I think it's kind of crazy. I truly believe that your body can not only heal itself, but it has essentially a lot of weight. Like there are various forms of healing, and we've seen that. And even from like an academic standpoint, there is an acknowledgement of various ways of healing. The problem is there is kind of a competition in terms of demonstrating that in terms of provability via drugs, and how those drugs essentially kind of push those changes on a much more, I think, from like an academic standpoint, from a much more rapid scale, that becomes like standard of care, that becomes part of the system, as opposed to if you're naturally healing your body, which is not just completely possible, but like, I truly believe that a lot of people should actually be aware that not only is your body extraordinarily powerful, but there are forces that we don't fully understand, that academic medicine does not fully understand, that have to be part of that conversation, right? Because it really does stem from almost this rift in understanding whether or not your body is more than just a biological series of cells. And that is kind of the core disagreement that people have. Because if it is just a biological series of cells, then that's why you have drugs, and that's why you have a lot of people who push on those drugs. But if it's more than that, if it has elements and properties, if there are things that are outside of the realm of biology that actually influences how biology is essentially shaped and created, right? And how time kind of affects the human body as well as the human condition. We know that from like the gut brain connection, for example. We know that from like even research that says there are things within the atmosphere and things within trauma that affect bodies. Those are not necessarily things that can be healed with drugs.
Because it's like cross disciplines. You've got that sounds like, psychology, physics, spirituality, and medicine. And so up until this point in modern American, and not just American, but definitely American and probably European and Canadian, we've siloed it out. And then we've like dismissed the natural perspectives, which I think is a shame, but I get that we want to like nail things down. We want to be like, okay, we need empirical proof. And it kind of feels like the wild, wild west when we add too many layers into it because our educational system just simply isn't set up for it.
I feel like everyone is lost out there because we have so much media and so many things being spewed and lied to, and these doctors and this nutritionist and this person says to do this.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to believe, and what is something that we don't know that we should know as women, I would say?
As women, oh my goodness. I think that you all have more power than you believe that you do. You're all extraordinarily equal in society and in the sight of God. And I think there's a lot of pressure that women have to essentially conform and to kind of model and look like a certain thing that shouldn't ever really be the case, I think.
That's incredible. We were watching Candace Owens the other day, and she just recently gave birth and said that she had Child Protection Services knocking on her door because she chose not to give her baby the vaccines.
And I knew exactly why. Yeah.
And so that's terrifying. To think that somebody might take your child away because you intuitively don't feel like that's the right thing to do.
So let me tell you why. Let me tell you how I know how the system was created. So I studied coercion in pediatrics when I was at Berkeley. That was my undergraduate thesis. I looked at a lot of the forces that essentially kind of create itself to structure against individuals that don't have the same level of autonomy as they would say. Autonomy has much more to do with they're considering the child's rights, the parents' rights, and the physician. And depending on the state that Candace was in, and in that sort of state situation, it's not even a matter of here's what the child wants and or desires. It's a matter of, is Candace more right than her doctor that says that this baby has to get that particular vaccine?
I mean, Candace couldn't be right because that's not her background, specialty, or education, but she's the mother, so therefore she should have the say.
Yes, she has a say, except when it comes to certain areas in healthcare.
I mean, that's terrifying.
The terrifying part. Yes.
So women who have an intuitive feeling about their child, like they were trying to push drugs on Penelope when they diagnosed her with ADHD and anxiety and depression, and all of her friends were pushed these drugs. Her took the drugs, frankly.
So you would have to argue from that standpoint, and that is why it is terrifying.
And that's why parents who are divorced can say, "Oh, my husband doesn't agree, or my wife doesn't agree, and so therefore I should have custody."
Yeah,
because the doctor has say over the medical rights of our child.
Yeah. So in our society, we still live in a system that is predominantly looking at a hierarchy of physicians and lawyers. And so if you understand that sort of hierarchy very, very well, it's almost like every force, every natural authority kind of comes from like the say of the expert. And unfortunately, the expert, like there's some things that they also do know, but the one thing that I think has to be much more in discussion is how do you treat then individuals that don't have the same level of knowledge? Do you push that onto them? Do you work alongside them? And the very, very last part is, do you then violate their rights? And that's the one thing that if I can advocate and emphasize even further, you do have rights as parents, you do have rights as moms, being able to justify why you don't feel comfortable and saying that the risk that is being forced upon your child is not even a risk that you would take personally is a much, much more powerful statement than saying, I just don't feel comfortable with this. Please don't vaccinate my
Okay, so you just said, I don't feel that I want to take this risk.
Yeah.
So that's the
risk is
language
the
that we
key
had to
word.
say, not say, I don't feel comfortable isn't strong enough. I'm not willing to take this risk.
Yep.
And therefore, so this is like a medical loophole. By the way, Diana's an expert in medical loopholes. And she's also an expert in medical ethics. And she understands how the system works. But I think moms, and one second, Penelope, I know you have something to say, but moms are scared to speak up.
Yeah.
The doctors told me to be quiet when Penelope was depressed, when she was addicted to food. They said, you're causing the problem, which I probably was. But still, like, don't talk about it. And then we have moms coming to us saying, I don't know how to talk to my kid with their terrible, addictive, whatever behaviors because they're eating, 16, muffins at lunch and they're
And their
gaining weight.
doctor's like, oh, just put your kid on Ozempic, which now
So
apparently for 8-year-olds can
know that you always have the power to say no. Know that you always have the power to walk away from a room, and know that just because someone is an expert or says that they're an expert does not necessarily mean that, one, you have to trust that person, or two, that person has your best interests at heart, or three, that even if they do meet all of those criteria, they could still also be wrong.
Yeah.
And so there is no, like, they should not be taking that power from you. The best sort of physician patient or even physician people relationship looks like them essentially proving themselves as being trustworthy, not necessarily even because of their education, but also because of their ethics, and them working alongside you because you want them to, not because they have to force that onto you.
Interesting. I mean, I read that one of the main causes of death is actually medical errors.
Yes.
This is medication, misdiagnosis. Like, I mean,
Yes.
so people don't realize that, although we need someone to trust, like you said, Penelope, we don't know who to trust, especially with nutrition.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the reasons I think that I realized that was the most effective thing after Western medicine failed me with my skin problems and all my other problems, acute problems. I don't think Western medicine really understands, like hormonal imbalances, skin problems. I mean, there's just some things that don't work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I had to find out after taking all of the drugs and harming my system. And eventually we figured it out. But it took me 30 years, multiple degrees, meeting thousands of hours of interviewing doctors, failing here, failing there. It's like we have to be able to trust.
Yes.
And maybe that's why we're all so driven by community.
Yeah.
And why people are saying, well, you don't have a degree. How can you be an influencer, especially for Penelope's era and your generation?
Crazy.
It's like now experts are not really qualified to be experts.
They're qualified, but remember, even if they're experts, their knowledge base does not translate into what they do with that. Like, what we know in ethics is that people have different values and different value judgments, and they make decisions differently based on that sort of structure of belief that they form. And a lot of things can affect those beliefs, like any sort of unhealed trauma around a topic, any sort of unhealed, relationship, how they want to be treated versus how somebody else would want to be treated, right? And most people are not extraordinarily flexible in terms of recognizing those differences. So they have to go under a certain sort of model. And the training that most physicians have within like their medical education and even within the field of bioethics, especially for pediatrics. And this is what is insidious. It's because the child does not have autonomy, right? And they are the expert over the parent, then they have the authority to essentially pull in some of the state forces, unless the state has those types of protections for parents. And there are a handful of states that do, but there are also other states that give a lot more deference to that physician, which makes it, I mean, this is also why it's extraordinarily scary. You can't just go to any doctor. You almost have to understand if your values align with that physician's value and how you both kind of see health and
You have to be
healing.
very careful about what pediatrician you hire. I mean, technically, I'm
Absolutely.
paying the physician, so
Yes.
I should be in charge of the relationship, technically. But no, it sounds like that's actually not true. Isn't
It's
that terrifying, Penelope? It's like you don't want to send your kid to school. You don't want to send your kid to the doctor. It's like, what are you supposed to do? But you do need a doctor sometimes.
I think it really depends. There are some physicians that have the level of humility that will absolutely let you kind of drive that relationship. I think that in ethics, at least, there is kind of this tension between non-maleficence and beneficence.
Can you translate that for the
Yes.
audience, please?
Yeah, so non-maleficence is essentially the principle of do no harm first, but that doesn't actually mean that they are going to do good. So if you walk past a stranger on the street and that stranger is essentially suffering and or dying, non-maleficence would say that you are not ethically obligated to essentially do anything to help that stranger. Versus if you're in a beneficence first ethics, that principle essentially says, well, you have to help that stranger, even if you're helping that stranger ends up harming that stranger. So that's kind of the tension in ethics in terms of how people essentially end up helping and treating human bodies. Human bodies are extraordinarily like delicate and this
And
is also
resilient.
and resilient.
When
But
given the right conditions.
yes.
Yeah.
And this is also kind of why we have like the regulatory system that we have set up, as well as like a lot of the legal protections. Most people don't understand their sort of legal rights as both like parents and patients. You do have legal rights that are protected under the Constitution. And that's what people don't remember. I think there's also kind of a tension in healthcare where they've also seen really horrifying instances of child abuse and of families that do abuse that.
That's tricky. And that we want the state to come in there because that's really, really
Yeah.
horrible. But do you think that like obese children is a kind of abuse? Do you think the parents are to blame?
For obese children,
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of obese children
I-
right now, and it's a really big problem.
I've not even thought about obese children. I think that obesity might be essentially driven by many other sorts of factors that are not just inclusive of parents. To one degree, you can probably have scenarios where parents are essentially overfeeding or saying or body shaming, right? For not like, because there are cultures that will body shame for anyone that is underweight. And that kind of creates a whole structure that leads onto obesity because of that level of shame.
Well, I think that it's actually because 60% of the calories are from ultra processed foods in America.
That's also another factor.
It's
That's
huge.
a huge factor.
Yeah.
right?
And I mean, on the one side, it's like, I don't necessarily want those foods to be consumed by families or because they're nutrient void.
Yeah.
But obesity is leading to so many other problems. And I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole in our society
Yeah.
that is driven by what I would consider unethical behavior because we're not educating our doctors in nutrition and we're not reversing chronic disease at a rate that's fast enough because our country is going to be is compromised, especially in your generation, Penelope.
I think
And so, we have to be able to have these dissenting opinions. I mean, I got canceled
absolutely.
when I was talking about just, taking vitamin D and lifestyle change for diabetes,
And
type
that's
2 reversal. And these doctors that you're working with are also like people have been
That's-
scared to speak up.
Yeah. Absolutely. People are scared to speak up. People are scared of being canceled. People are scared of losing their license, mostly because there were some things that happen within the university context where you can talk about every other thing except certain sorts of topics, mostly because they have ruled that to be a form of pseudoscience or a form of anti-science. Pseudoscience, anti-science.
I was asking you this earlier, and because you brought up what we can and can't speak about, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I was telling you like, oh, it'd be so cool to be on TED, and
Yeah.
you were on TED, right?
So I was the youngest TED licensee at 14. I led a whole movement of other young organizers during that time, and that became like a Southern California movement of TEDx youth organizers. But we had certain guidelines within TED, mostly created by TED's brain trusts of scientists and Nobel laureates, that said, we've already looked at the data around this topic. You cannot speak on this topic because we've already verified that that data is not verifiable and or does not exist and or is considered pseudoscience, anti-science, anti-medicine.
Who owns TED?
So TED was originally owned or started from a guy. His name was Richard Saul Wurman. He actually now created something called Tinker. That platform got sold to Chris Anderson. Chris Anderson owns TED. They're now essentially owned by someone else. I think they're like kind of in the process of restructuring and giving that platform up. But during that time, this was around like 2012, they had set up certain guidelines in terms of the types of speakers that I was allowed to essentially invite, as well as those that don't.
So who was pulling the strings, though? I mean, what were they afraid of? Why weren't they willing to challenge beliefs?
Because even though they gave out their branding and trust to community organizers and licensees, and they've set up certain types of guidelines. I can still invite like certain types of individuals onto that stage, even at 14. But the fear was I would lose my license or I would not be able to host another TED event if I had invited individuals that they basically cautioned against.
No, I understand that, but I'm like, but why? Why can't we just have normal conversations
That's what I
challenge
asked.
beliefs based on personal stories?
Yeah.
Some people might say, well, Penelope, there's no way she could have lost 160 pounds because it's like, but she did.
In the academic community, personal stories are the lowest form of data, mostly because they're not as physically proven as randomized controlled trials, right?
Those randomized controlled trials could be bought by and funded by many companies that are extremely corrupt that have their own agenda behind them.
Yes, so you can still corrupt randomized controlled trials. It's harder, mostly because you can also find points in which the level of corruption is there. But the reason why it's so much harder to essentially challenge and push back against certain sorts of things that would become standard of care within healthcare, within medicine, right, based on personal stories, is because for them, unless it's reproducible, right, that is the key word, unless other people can get the same results by doing the same sort of things that you're doing, then it's not real or it's not true. And it's easier to demonstrate that on a biological molecular level with drugs than it is to essentially demonstrate that with personal stories and testimonies.
What's so fascinating about what you're saying is the other day I was listening to the Huberman Lab talking to Theo Vaughn, I think it was, and I heard him say, it's really a little bit scary that some scientists can make studies and then by their opinion of what the outcome they want, if they get that outcome, they don't have to retest that study. And if the people participating are like, okay, good to go, you never have to try it again.
You can always have like a peer review process, right? But the problem is when an overwhelming amount of scientists only buy into a certain scientific narrative because that's a set of truth, those truths don't get challenged. And when those truths don't get challenged, then you automatically, because there's so much information, you automatically say, it's okay if it's on that category. It's not okay if it's on that. So there are some categories that get so much more scrutinized and don't ever even rank, come to pass in terms of a standard of care versus others that get automatic pass from the scientific academic community because that's already within the subset of narrative that they've been trained to not only agree with and accept, but that they can say then, well, here's the data around that. So even within like the sphere of academic politics, there is still that level of reproducibility. It's just whether or not they're funded to do that and who verifies that. And I think the more pressing concern that most people have is there are two challenges. One, if scientists can't talk about those disagreements and understand that like science is not itself God, science is a tool for testing. Science is a tool for testing. And that is it. That's all that science is. It doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not you're going to have the same level of results. It provides a level of statistic and a level of information, but whether or not that is what you choose to essentially base your life on, right? That's where legal comes in. That's also where relationships come in. That's where
That's what's scary about the drugs too. It's like they can keep prescribing you the same drug and never retest it or relook at it or anything, and just keep selling it forever.
Vaccines, drugs, and I think for me the bigger concern is getting people off the drugs. We don't actually know what happens after Ozempic, life after Ozempic. We don't know what life like if you decide to stop taking your sleep medication, like you can become psychotic. If you stop taking your Wellbutrin, I mean, to me, it's so evil. And I'm just going to call it out. I think it's evil to prescribe somebody something that you think is going to help them, but not give them a pathway that insurance pays for to get them off of it.
Yeah. Can I ask you why it's legal to sell drugs on TV?
Oh my gosh, that's the best question ever.
Why it's legal? Because healthcare is still a consumer-driven model. No matter what, your corporate system is still going to try to figure out who is going to pay for what.
One of the most profitable industries, and their ads are phenomenal. So how is the public supposed to not consume the propaganda we're being sold to every day?
You have to understand where your essential agreements and disagreements with a particular drug is.
Back to ethics.
This is where my head keeps going. We weren't taught this in school. We weren't taught this in school. We weren't taught this anywhere. And if you haven't done the research, like someone like Dr. Michelle the other day, she was like, Michelle Perro, love her. Shout out to her. She was like, we all have to be PhDs now to go grocery shopping. And I'm like, you're so right. Yeah. But how are we supposed to know? Like I'm serious.
You're not taught things in school. So in school, right? Like when we were in school, I think there was a lot of trusts around community-based organizations and like the way that the system was structured and created. There's a lot less tension around the areas of disagreement, mostly because, again, if you can trust, society functions much, much more rapidly. Well, the problem with that is when you had massive vaccination campaigns and a utilitarian-based ethics model that basically says we're okay with some people dying and getting killed and getting traumatized and getting injured, and we'll silence their voices, right? We won't let them actually go on camera. We won't let them actually say their narrative because everyone around them is going to think that they're crazy.
Are doctors incentivized to give prescription medication?
Are they incentivized? Not necessarily. Depends on the physician.
Well, hold on. If they're taught in school, about pharmacology.
They are.
So in a way, they're incentivized all the way through to the root of their education.
It's more like they're brainwashed into believing that some drugs is demonstrated to help a certain subset of the population.
Because I genuinely think doctors want to help. I mean, they do. And they're indoctrinated, which is at the highest level of incentivization, brainwashed, you said, to help their patients in the best way they know how, because they're not trained necessarily in understanding how to mobilize the natural mechanisms of the body to initiate healing through the detoxification or the gut microbiome issues that
so part of the problem is not let's get rid of individuals that have that level of training. It's let's actually look at medical education and let's see what these individuals are not just learning, but on the scale of if they're being taught and reinforced that you can treat several conditions by essentially diagnosing them. And that's how they get paid, diagnosis, right? And prescribing to treat that diagnosis, then that's kind of a cycle of how their brains work.
And it
It's
doesn't work.
diagnosis and
It doesn't
treatment.
work.
Diagnosis and treatment.
Like, because the treatments are not like, if you really want to heal a human, it's not by just giving them a pill, and it's not going to be in 14 minutes a year of a relationship, which is the average of what physicians and patients have.
So if what I'm hearing is correct, big pharma and pharmaceutical companies have been so deeply rooted. They're in the curriculum of these doctors and surgeons. And that's why surgeons and doctors are giving out pills like it's candy, because that's what they were taught.
So it's a little more complicated than that, mostly because what they do is they produce research studies that then get read and or seen in these medical education. And what they do is they target hospitals directly. And so if you're a big pharma company or even a small pharma, you need to, in order for your drug to essentially survive in that market, you need to demonstrate proof of concept and build a lot of provider connections and relationships, and then go to all these hospitals and essentially demonstrate to them that you have the product that they need and you have the rubber stamp behind it.
Okay, so is
the
it
rubber
about sales or is it about health?
The rubber stamp is FDA approved, right? And the rubber stamp is also through the legal mechanisms of protection.
Okay, but is it about sales or health? What do you think? What do you say?
It depends on what we're talking about.
But in general, like if you have a
It
majority.
depends on what we're talking about.
Ozempic.
Ozempic, I don't know much about Ozempic, so I cannot say, but I can say this. I can say that when you're in that high place of pharma and you're looking at big levels of financial gain, all right, that can be produced by having either a monopoly on the market or a monopoly on health, you're going to do everything that you can to essentially get that drug out and push.
Okay,
And you're not necessarily the ones pushing the drugs. See, pharma does not push drugs onto the public because they know that essentially two things. The public will either demand the drugs through the commercials, or the public has to then rely on the doctor to essentially give them the drugs. And so they're targeting much more the physicians as opposed to the consumer. The consumer they target mostly because there are some physicians that don't believe in a particular drug or don't believe in pushing that, right? And because it's still a consumer-based model, they can still advertise that drug on TV as long as they put certain types of disclaimers, like please talk to your doctor about like all of these things that you have.
And like
And all of
5x
these side effects.
speed so that we can't even hear what they're saying.
And
then
that's-
we're
but
just-
I
That's
feel
what
like
it's for.
driven is like hopelessness, where people just think there's a pill for everything, and they don't like go to the sun, go to sleep, go to food. Like they've lost complete orientation around what's true and what's real and what's viable.
Yeah.
It's just shocking. Sorry, Penelope, what were you going to
I
say?
remember being in school with this girl who was obese, and I promised myself I'd never get like her. Well, I did get like her. And I promised myself I'd never get stretch marks in my stomach because we were 13 at the time, and she had purple stretch marks all over her stomach, and her mom was morbidly obese her whole life.
Yeah.
Her mom got bariatric surgery.
Yeah.
That's the shortcut answer to obesity. And now it's Ozempic. And then it's bariatric surgery.
Yeah.
You know what she told me? She was 13. She said, I'm not going to lose the weight. It's too hard. I'm just going to get bariatric surgery when I turn 18. And my jaw dropped to the floor.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't believe that at 13 years old, we were already so brainwashed at the time. We didn't have Ozempic.
Mm-hmm.
To think that that was the answer for our obesity or our eating problem. That we were just going to get it chopped off. But that doesn't work ever. Like most people who get bariatric surgery gain the weight back plus more, and they hurt themselves even more.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking, I'm like, why are we allowing this? And why are we not speaking it? Like, why isn't it exposed more?
It seems unethical. Like, let's just call it out. Like, it feels evil.
But are you saying
Seems
it's not
unethical?
ethical, or are you saying it is?
No, I am saying it is
Okay.
unethical, but I'm explaining why people see it as
Got it.
ethical.
Got it. Well, I also
And why the Healing Policy Institute exists, to help bring these conversations to the light and say, okay, let's create some policy to change the root of the problem.
So what's
That's
the
what I hear.
policy you're making right now? Can you talk about these things at all?
I think right now we're actually just community building among physicians that have very, very, very different views from each other.
Okay, so give
Right.
us an example.
Yeah.
So a
What
good
are-
example is ozone. So ozone is not Ozone is actually not FDA approved as a therapy. There are different sorts of forms in which people have like claim that it helps to some degree, but
Right, like
those,
injected into your body, sniffed through your nose. And there's some people who
yeah,
say it's a noxious gas that should be avoided at all costs because it will damage
yes.
human cells.
That's what people say about the sun. They say the sun's going to kill you. Wear this toxic sunscreen.
So having those conversations and having credible providers actually have those conversations and look at data and research, and
Doctors are terrified to use ozone or
how
even
can
admit
that-
they do.
but they can't even talk about it.
Dentists won't even use it, even though it's great for and it
So
strengthens enamel.
that's the problem. If you can't talk about it, if you can't talk about it among your colleagues, if you can't look at the data, if you can't then essentially either do randomized controlled trials or say there is none, but there is a plurality of research. That's also the other thing that I've learned. Physicians are not necessarily researchers. They follow after standards of care. They don't do their own research because they're overwhelmed and they can't. So they have to look at a governing body and a governing organization to tell them, this is what, we approve of. This is what you're not going to get in trouble for prescribing. But here's the problem. If there's if there's like 100 to 1,000 research studies on a specific topic, it's not going to get to your doctor unless you pull it up.
Right, and
So
ozone
be
can
your
harm
own
you.
doctor.
Yeah.
And when your doctor tells you that you can take Ozempic because it outweighs the benefits, or the benefits outweigh the risks, be really careful and be your own researcher because they did not do that research on the 100,000 things you just said.
So let me kind of clarify, mostly because most people are doctors still have that level of training where they can look at data and make risk benefit assessments, right? So you can still work alongside your doctor, but here is the one critical piece of information that everyone should know. They have every right to walk away from that room. They have every right to say no. You have every right to get another doctor, get a doctor that you feel much more comfortable with, that aligns with your values and your decision making and your judgment, as well as, have that sort of empowerment around your decision. Because that is actually what is protected under the law. That models the right types of relationships. If you don't feel comfortable in your healthcare system and that sort of model, you do not have to step foot in that environment. And from like a physician standpoint, what we're working on is trying to get these providers to actually talk to each other so that some of their views around certain types of topics, for example, can start to shift.
Like, is ultra processed food dangerous or is it not? I would say yes, it is.
Well, just to wrap up what you
Can we get
said,
some policy
it's
around
super
that?
important because I was sitting down with the doctor, Dr. Mary Pardee, and she said, like, I don't really believe in nature anymore.
Even though she's a naturopath.
And she was like, the benefits outweigh the risks of Ozempic. And I had a stack of paper, which is in the closet, I can show you, but I'm not going to. But I had a stack of paper with all of the risks and trials and studies. And she was like, oh, it's good for the heart. And I'm like, okay, well, what about these 5 studies that they did on how it harmed the heart and harmed the heart valve and the connection to the brain? And what about the vagus nerve? And what about all these things? No comment. And so I'm just illustrating that to you guys to be, yes, you can listen to your doctor, but like you said, you don't have to follow what they say. You can walk out of the room. You can do your own research. You can get a second opinion, get a different doctor, because
you're always in control of your relationship with every interaction, including in healthcare. You're in control of that relationship. It's your body.
It is your body, but like, let's say you've got an unfortunate cancer diagnosis.
Yes.
And you're going to get overwhelmed with options.
Absolutely.
And how are you supposed to make the decision? And, chemotherapy is extremely dangerous and life-threatening. And so is cancer. And it's like, it's always this kind of.
So that's the dance that your last guest essentially was dancing around. And that dance is going to look differently per person based on their sort of value system, right? And so that goes back into ethics. And that's also why it's so important for people to understand their legal rights under the law. Like, you do not, like, I will repeat this, if you don't feel comfortable in a situations, especially in a medical situation, you can walk out. You can go to another practice. You can call another practitioner up. We have probably the greatest network of independent medical providers that are not necessarily within a hospital system that have seen a lot more results. You can always walk away from a hospital. There are so many different ways to heal. We've seen people that have, really, really experience a huge aspect of medical trauma actually get the care and help they need in the same sort of setting, but with like a different provider.
It is really interesting.
And so
sorry.
yeah.
We went to a doctor who's functionally minded, a medical doctor, and he had everyone sign releases because he wanted to have the freedom, without his license being threatened, to talk about things that he believed in. That's incredible that doctors have to go to that length to just cover their ass, basically.
Because
it's really shocking. And so I'm just, in California, I know like dozens of moms who've left the state because they didn't want to give their children the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a whole hiatus of people leaving this state because of medical problems.
Because of medical freedom and because of just the lack of protection.
And doctors can't even tell the truth that they intuitively, common sense realize because their medical license will be threatened, which then destabilizes their family, puts them in jeopardy, and threatens their identity as a doctor in their community.
So there is that sort of tension. Remember, with physicians, there are a lot of physicians that really do believe like in the fullness of vaccines and in the fullness of actually recommending what they're recommending to their patients, right? There are others that don't, but there are many, many, many more that do. And so there is a sort of medical cultural war that is going on. And that's essentially what this policy institute is supposed to be able to provide space for the physicians that disagree with their colleagues or that are open-minded enough to listen to those disagreements and to actually actively talk about them and to clarify those topics, because that hasn't even happened within the setting of medicine. That hasn't happened within the setting of a hospital, mostly because people are not thinking about, let's actually settle a particular topic and get closer to truth. They're thinking about, let's save lives from the set of systems that we already have in place, even if that means we end up harming that life.
Yeah, and if you're hearing this right now and you think that you want to learn more about the Healing Sciences Policy Institute and Diana's work, definitely go to her website. We're going to put that in the show notes and, help her contribute. See if you want to join the movement, because it's really important work. We should really be like in this channel discussing these topics, because the future physician is really you. Until this mess, I'm going to call it a mess, until this mess gets cleared up, which I think it will. I think your generation will demand it, Penelope. And it's really up to us to get educated. And there are always risks. Every day, every decision we make has a consequence. It has risk.
Uterus has risk.
Yeah, like my doctors told me, oh, it doesn't matter what you eat. It has no connection to your acne, your eczema, and all the other issues you were having. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, but they didn't know any better. So they couldn't tell me that. But it led me on a 30-year journey to become an expert in culinary medicine and food is medicine, which everyone has always said to me, don't talk about that. You can't write that on your website. Are you kidding me?
You can absolutely, number one, you can absolutely talk about that. And number two, if you end up finding or bringing alongside someone with an MD or a PhD that wants to talk about that, that's not... The one thing that I think a lot of people are scared of is the board going to essentially constitute that the practice of medicine and take my license away. And to that end, I can say no, that talking about something does not constitute the practice of medicine. And on top of that, if you do actually practice it, there are ways to not only justify that from like another standpoint of healing, but from the standpoint of if it helps, if no one dies, if the only aspect of disagreement is your colleague saying that we believe that you're killing someone else and they don't have verifiable proof that that is actually what is killing other people, you should absolutely stand up against that and fight that.
Interesting. Well, we have people losing weight every day of the week, and they're gaining freedom because they're not addicted anymore. They don't have cravings anymore. Their skin is glowing.
So you should absolutely stand up for that, because the law will always protect. Like, the law was set up in such a way where the reason why people are scared is because of something called unprofessional conduct, right? And that's a catch-all that happens. It's about 20 or so states have that catch-all in their licensing, disciplinary code. So that's a code determined by the medical board. And unless you understand how the medical board thinks and sees certain sorts of things on a state-by-state basis, which I actually ended up doing before doing this type of work, it's really hard, mostly because people are then terrified of essentially challenging the medical board and or their colleagues, right? Until you then start to realize there are two ways in which a complaint actually ends up getting to the board. Number one, your colleagues can make that complaint. It is a lot easier to kind of defend against that from like a legal perspective, so long as, again, nothing that you do is actually harming anyone. Your patients are not being harmed. You can produce that level of testimony before the board. And if that still ends up harming individuals because of their license, you can still push against that. Mostly because right now I think there is kind of that shift in like medical narrative where people are starting to see that like the whole aspect of like a regulatory board is to protect people. And if that protection is actually just protecting the system, then that's also going to be challenged on like a massive statewide, like 50 state level.
So now I understand also why the HHS is going about it the way they're going about it.
Yeah.
Like, let's fix the food system.
Yeah.
You know, they're not starting with the medical education, although nutrition education is on the table. It's just interesting.
I have a question. What's the biggest lie that Americans have been told about their health and their freedom in health?
That's a good question. I would say that you have to listen to authority. I think that's probably the biggest lie. Just because someone has a title, just because they went through like 20 plus years of education, right? I have 2 degrees. I have a master's in healthcare management, and I went to law school, and I was kind of top of my class on both. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to listen to me, and that's also the case for anyone, any American, right? I think that the biggest lie is that you have to listen to someone that has more education than you. More education just means that you have more knowledge about a specific area. That doesn't necessarily mean that you know everything about everything.
Right. How could anyone know everything about everything?
But do you respect like your generation? You guys look at influencers as experts?
We respect people who are honest with us. So if you're like, I messed up yesterday, I told this patient she had this disease and I was wrong. We're like, okay, I'm glad you could admit that. But we don't like liars, and we see through liars now. I think we're starting to see through liars. Of course, there's one side of my generation that's completely crazy and brainwashed and thinks that being fat is gorgeous and that it's hot to be 600 pounds and that we should just be eating all the junk food because no food is bad food.
And being binary.
Crazy. Those people are going crazy in their head, and they're either going to come around like I did or they're going to die very soon.
Yeah. I think
because of their own choices.
Probably the other aspect is if someone ever says that you don't have the right to walk away from a situation or that you have to trust this person because this person's the only option.
In school, we were taught that. School, we were taught
another lie.
Like that's the other lie we were taught in school is that once you're in school, you got to go to the next school. So if you're in high school, you got to go to college, you know? And and my parents were like, "Oh, you got to go to college, Penelope. Like that's the way." And here I am sitting with you, learning the most amazing things that they would not teach me this in college.
Yeah.
College wouldn't teach me anything I've learned. School didn't teach me how to sew, garden, cook. You taught me that.
Yeah.
So for any young girls listening, be empowered, and you don't have to go to college.
No, but you do need to read, and you need to learn to write, and you need to learn to argue, and you need to learn
you can
how
do
to
that
develop your ideas and critically think.
You can do that in a homeschool system.
But you aren't getting the critical thinking skills that you
I
do
was
get in
indoctrinated at
university.
school.
No, you and I are debating.
Listen.
I guess I'll develop those too. Here we go.
I was indoctrinated at school. I did not learn how to debate, speak, talk. I don't remember anything I learned in school. I'm not kidding you. I don't remember a single thing from middle school up. Nothing. Not at 0. Why? Because they locked me in a room with a bunch of kids teaching us all the same thing from a textbook And what I thought
So
was so
there are
weird is why did
different
that textbook change every year?
there are different ways of learning. I think the interesting part, and this is maybe where TED got things right when they focus on like education and different forms of learning, right? There's a person in India that was trying to develop a different form of school. And there are different sorts of universities that are kind of emerging that try to kind of cater towards those experiential learning exploits, things where you learn by experience, you learn by testing, you learn
That's
by
what they did.
trying.
That's what my
Right.
first schools did, but those schools weren't public schools.
Yeah.
And they were very expensive. And yeah, you're right. All we did was spend time in nature and touch little chickens and watch them grow and go in the forest and make honey from trees. And I learned a lot.
You mean
doing that.
sap, like maple syrup?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Honey from trees. That's so cute.
Honey from
So,
trees. Well, there are bees around trees.
There are a million ways to learn.
Yeah,
Like,
you're
just
right.
like there are
You're
different
right.
forms of healing and like finding like I think that our traditional educational model tends to have to disseminate like massive amounts of information, and like you might be someone like me that can like just absorb different forms of learning, right? But most people are not that. Like
But also teach the truth. Teach us the sun is good for us, and make us go outside and look at the sun and feel the difference.
But that
between
truth
being
has to
lost
be
in a box
debated.
that truth has
than
to
being
be
in the
Because
sun.
that's what Diana's Healing Institute, her health policy institute is about. Because Penelope, there's enough data right now showing that there is oxidative damage from the sun, and it can cause the disintegration of your eyes, of your skin, and this, that, and the other. You and I believe that
We
the
could
skin
walk
is
outside
beneficial.
and die. That's probably like a 50% chance. But we don't die when we walk outside.
But this is part of why we have to. What is the truth?
But that's what I'm
And
saying.
then
School
how do
doesn't
you
teach
define
that.
what it is?
School isn't teaching us.
We all have to come to our truth. And my truth today is different than my truth was when I was 24.
There's also I think we're also entering into an era where I feel like people have to start testing even the things that they considered to be true, right?
Like
And
gender?
So there's like for example, the whole transhumanist movement, right? As some people would say it, but trans ideology. A lot of my past clients that, came together and did that amicus, they truly believed in the fact that they were trans. That's why they went into those hospitals. About like, I would say 60 to 70% of them. And then the 30% of them that didn't ended up going into those spaces because of societal pull for that truth, right? They either had parental pressure that pressured them into that, or they had, social acceptance in terms of truth. The problem with truth and testing truth is you almost have to test it. Just because someone believes in something or says something doesn't necessarily make it true.
Can you show me a test that God exists?
A test that God exists? Well, I think that has to be felt in every single person.
Penelope, do you have a test that I love you?
No.
Do you know what I mean? There are like a lot of things that we can't test.
There's some things that you
because there's too many variables. Like, can I say that indefinitely when a tomato plant gets this exact nutrient from I don't know, Miracle Grow, or it gets it from the fish emulsion?
Yeah.
Maybe there's 65 different ways for the plant to get that. You know what I mean? It's like that's why they haven't been able to. For me, it's like it's a trap.
What I mean by test is usually. So there are things that people kind of latch onto because of certain unhealed experiences that become part of their truth.
Totally.
Right. And those are things that I think are a lot more like dangerous, mostly because when something is true, it feels true and it feels freeing.
But we can't but feeling isn't going to be like policy making.
It's not policy making, but it translates into policy making. Policy making essentially takes the plurality of data, right? And you have those data based on those experiences. And so when people have those experiences, the really smart scientists would go, oh my gosh, I just had this experience. I want to see if I can somehow produce a research around that.
Yeah, most science is produced based on a hunch, and then they want to reproduce it. That's the whole deal.
That's the whole scientific method.
How is the government regulating drugs that are being sold online that are kind of like off the market or off the label or not regulated at all? Because on TikTok right now, there are these obese women who are selling like affiliate links that they're getting from companies. We had a company reach out to us trying to get us part of their Ozempic program.
Yeah.
They're like off-the-label Ozempic drugs, pills,
Weight loss
juices,
medication, yeah.
weight loss injections, and they have an affiliate link so people get these discounts. And young
gonna
girls are really, really tempted to buy it right now because we are in this society of Ozempic now. Where's the regulation on that? And how does one go about reporting these things? Because literally, if I showed you my TikTok page, you could find like 7 people who know nothing about health. They're not MDs, but they're able to sell these drugs and make money off of them, but they're not even real drugs.
So if they're not real drugs, you can like essentially, I mean, there are 2 versions. One, if it's not regulated and it's not necessarily sold by it's there's no research behind that and it's not FDA approved, then the only way that they can actually get a product to market is by having someone who's not licensed essentially push that out, right? Hence the influencer.
Isn't there more regulation on TikTok? That
For
can kill people. It is killing people.
For consumer products, because consumer products are regulated differently than pharmaceuticals.
But it's technically a pharmaceutical.
Well, they're labeling it as
consumer
supplement?
Products are not pharmaceuticals.
Maybe it's a nutritional supplement.
So how do you go about taking people like that down? Because it's harming a lot of people.
You can't so you're still living in a free market, right? So in a free market,
we like that.
In a free market, that means there is going to probably be some products that are not as beneficial and not as trustworthy.
Switzerland, there isn't a free market.
People making money off of it. You know, like an MLM for Ozempic, basically.
Yeah. So
that's totally fine.
It's fine insofar as, again, the way, like, you'd have to essentially look at how they're structured.
You know what's confusing to me? If we were doing this with cocaine, boom, gone. It would be gone.
Do you want to know why? Because cocaine, like, as soon as you have an epidemic and you have leaders essentially banning certain sorts of things on an FDA scale, right, and labeling that as dangerous, then you can start essentially regulating that and banning that on a mass public scale. But
what's different from cocaine than Ozempic?
From Ozempic? So again, you have to essentially look at whether or not Ozempic has any sort of research behind that, whether or not Ozempic has the level of effects that, say, cocaine has, compare that across the 50 states, to make that decision.
It wasn't even approved safe and effective for weight loss, and yet they're handing it out by the million. Yeah. And here's the other thing. It's like so I worked with a doctor at the Linus Pauling Institute who was a toxologist, and he had plenty of data for chemotherapy prevention through phytonutrient therapy. Yeah. One of the main reasons why you get metastatic cancer, that's like, metastatic expression of cells, which is considered cancer. This is very dangerous cancer, is because of toxic load. So once your DNA shows a certain level of toxicity, your DNA mutates into a metastatic state. Mm-hmm. So we have the data, we have the research, we have it backed by an institute. Knowing this, why aren't we mandating that people take on serious detoxification to reverse DNA mutation and therefore get a handle on cancer? Well, we know cancer is a $2 billion industry.
So in order for that to essentially be mandated or at least pushed a lot more, remember that
we have a lot of research is what I'm saying. Yeah, this is just one example.
That special language called standard of care, right? So that has to be essentially standard of care. Standard of care tends to be kind of peer-reviewed process by a medical organization. So whoever is essentially leading the American Board of Oncology, right? Not just on like a statewide scale. We're not talking state because state regulates the practice of medicine, but it's really the national organizations that set the standard of care. And those standards of care then essentially is how like a lot of the physician colleagues end up pushing it.
So Jay Bhattacharya was being confirmed. He's at his hearing. Mm-hmm. And he said, we don't know what cures obesity. First of all, you don't cure. I don't look at obesity as disease. It's not, you don't cure it. But anyway, and I'm like, jaw drops. I'm like, I know how we're doing it every day.
So do you want to know how he knows or not know?
What's the standard of care?
He's looking at a body of research right, from Google scholars and from probably Stanford Medicine, right? And that research accumulates into whether or not he can be certain about a certain topic versus not. His training, as well as his wife's training, tends to be, kind of interesting because they're both coming from like the standpoint of California. And unless you're looking at 50 states, unless you're looking at like the data that you're also seeing, unless you get that in front of his face, and by getting that in front of his face, looking at the sources of trust, which are if that is published in an accredited journal, right? If that is not, then that is the type of rigor that we as an academic medical society tends to look at.
No, but it's like a maze. I mean, we know
It's designed to keep you sick and slow so that they can make as much money as possible and then kill you off. And I think that's torture. That's human torture.
It's an Egyptian system. So you have to, like, in order to get that out there, right? You have to publish in an accredited journal. In order to get published in an accredited journal, you probably have to either understand the journal editors and how they essentially see. So you have to then compete among the body of research.
that's why Peter McCullough is who he is, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of interesting because he's not the only one. And
Good.
that's the problem. I think that's the one thing that I have to like re-emphasize. Peter McCullough, Pierre Corey, and all of these other heroes of health freedom, they became heroes of health freedom because they translated their work into the public. They're not the only ones. There are credible and amazing scientists, physicians, and practitioners out there that see this data every day. They're not getting recognized and beaten by their colleagues because they're not on social media and they're not out there.
But they need to be.
They need
So
to be. That's the group of people that I work with.
The people you're working with, are you getting a camera on them? Do they have a place they can speak like this so that we can have like every mama know what to not feed and feed her kid? Because
And know who to trust.
and I want our generation, the young girls to know what to eat and what to not eat, what pills to take and not take, what their doctors are saying that's true and not true.
Yeah, no, we don't have a camera on them right now. We are kind of still working on that community building, mostly
Can you
because
put a voice memo on them? Can you voice memo them?
No, but
I can voice memo.
If you're hearing this right now and you're as excited and inspired as we are, definitely go to Diana's website,
Contribute.
donate to the
Donate
nonprofit
now.
so that she can get her infrastructure up and running. And let's please, I mean, it's a nonprofit. It's a tax write-off for you. All right. So
I can't wait. Like seriously, I want to hear the conversations that are going on.
well, we're coming to the end of our time, but I would like to re-inspire our audience because we've talked about a lot of doomsday stuff. So what is the biggest opportunity right now to reclaim our healthcare, especially for women and families?
Oh my God.
To reclaim our healthcare system.
Good question.
There's got to be an opportunity here because wherever there's like such a breakdown of ethics and reason and common sense, what is the biggest healthcare opportunity to reclaim, reclaim our healthcare?
That's a really, really good question. I think starting to recognize a lot of what went wrong and talking about the stories that have not been as known. So I think right now there's a level of shift that's happening with regards to people who have been injured. Getting that on the spotlight, having them talk about those experiences without feeling any sort of shame and any sort of fear and without being afraid. Also, your physician, like you might have an amazing physician, having that person showcase, asking them about the harm in the current sort of healthcare model, asking them what they would change, and then also challenging those changes. I think that is what starts that conversation and what starts to build that sort of momentum towards saying that this is wrong. The other aspect that I probably want to emphasize even more is I love bringing people together that have not just very, very different views, but that might be individuals responsible for directly harming the person in front of them. And that is what is needed in order for healing to take place. for them to be able to see how their experiences as a patient in the system that is reinforced by the person sitting across the room from them has affected them. Because there is a lot of power in that narrative experience, and as well as a lot of the ramifications that happen after they had those experiences. And so those trauma narratives, those stories of absolute medical abuse, that's not going to waste. That actually helps teach people that sort of lesson of this is not helpful. This is actually harming.
So what I'm hearing you say is reclaiming our healthcare is really about reclaiming our power.
Yes.
It's reclaiming also the responsibility we have to just be honest
Absolutely.
and to take full accountability of where we are and
Yeah.
who we're trusting
Yeah.
and for the outcomes that we're creating. I think we've really ended this era of passing blame.
Yeah.
And now it's time to take responsibility. And through that, we're not only going to take back our power,
Yeah.
we're also going to take back our health, which is power,
Yes.
and also reclaim our freedom.
Yes. Absolutely.
Love it.
You're brilliant.
Absolutely.
You are
Isn't
brilliant.
she brilliant?
You are brilliant. You are brilliant.
I mean, her brain. I just want your brain positioned exactly where it needs to be to create the changes that are required in healthcare reform.
and also, thank you
Thank
for
you.
doing this. This is amazing. This is needed.
Thank you for
Our
having
world
me.
needs this. They need you. So go donate to this because we all need to know the information. We need to be our researchers and learn what you are sharing and what these doctors are sharing.
And definitely comment down below. If you don't understand what we're talking about, comment down below if you have a story to share. Whatever.
Share this with one of your indoctrinated friends. Share this with one of your uneducated friends. Share this with someone who thinks they know it all, but they know nothing. Share this with them because they need to know, because I didn't know, and now I know a little more, and I feel a little bit better about what I know.
Definitely like this podcast and subscribe if you haven't already.
Yeah.
What else would we like to say to our viewers, Penelope, before we wrap?
To go donate.
Yeah.
Now, go donate to her.
And Diana, any message that just kind of ball in your court, like anything else you want to say? Just
Oh my gosh. I feel so blessed and honored. I think, again, really kind of going back to the reason why we have the problems that we have is we don't have the right people in the rooms actually making those decisions and talking about that. Mostly because if we close off certain types of individuals that have the powerful stories and the powerful narratives, we don't really even get to that conversation of like not just truth, but of healing. Healing takes a level of acknowledgement of this has harmed me. This is what has harmed me. And I know who has harmed me, right? And so I think in our society, there is a need for justice, right? But there's also a need for forgiveness. We gotta be able to walk past that level of harm and not recreate that harm. And I think that's essentially how history ends up creating this cycle of harm. And how like a lot of physicians that do have stories of harm that truly believe in what they're doing as right end up harming more, mostly because there are levels of trauma that have not necessarily been addressed. And when that's not addressed, when people are upset, when people are not completely aware of what they're doing, they perpetuate that harm. And so it's almost this cycle of hurt people.
sure. And I think a lot of moms are doing that to their kids.
Yeah.
Because they're, have dysregulated eating, dysregulated emotional patterns. They're relying on a corporate food system
They're
to
not educated. and they're not
supply their
willing to
family
educate
with food.
themselves.
Yeah. And so, no, there's like a whole level, all these different levels of justice. I mean, I think and teach and talk a lot about justice, cellular justice, alignment with nature's law for justice, the outcomes that we create with our health as a kind of justice. But if we're being misled by standard of care practices that are not common sense, we really, moms especially, need to step in and do what is right for your families.
Yeah. And you are powerful. You are powerful moms. Like, don't ever let anyone say otherwise. I know that the system kind of works up against.
We control
A lot
the
of the-
GDP. We
yeah.
control the election. We can, we're the reason why Kennedy's in. I mean, like,
Yes.
We
100%.
control a lot.
Yes.
We're the ones spending the money, which means we're dictating supply and demand. I mean,
Yes.
there's so many levels to our
Yes.
power. So don't ever forget how powerful you are, moms.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you all the time.
Hey, we noticed that 79.2% of you are not subscribed, which means you're watching our videos, you like the content, but you haven't made the commitment. So we would love it if you would subscribe. And if you want to join our Women's Accountability Group, don't forget to click the link in the description to join. We're only accepting amazing, awesome, and ready women. So please join if you're one of those. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and we will see you all the time.